This article popped up in my Facebook feed this week, and it got me thinking about mandatory helmet laws, head injuries and all that kind of thing, because we're obviously seeing the police in some locations fining lots of people for not wearing a helmet, because there's this very strong belief that not wearing a helmet doesn't protect you from head injuries, or, sorry, maybe the other way around, that wearing a helmet is the best protection against getting a serious head injury or dying, etc., when riding a bike. And therefore we have the steepest fines in the country in New South Wales for not wearing a helmet. But I thought I'd look at a couple of data points to see does that really hold true just on the surface. So let's go into this and have a look. I'll probably take about 15 minutes to go through this, so please bear with me. And none of this is scripted, I'm just talking on the fly. So obviously it's a pretty steep fine in New South Wales, $344. Interesting that 7 councils had no helmet fines, whereas there were some areas where the police are really cracking down. And this particular article has been lifted from a journal article by a couple of legal academics who are concerned about the police using essentially the fact that someone's not wearing a helmet as an entry into doing strip searches or whatever, which is really not the intent of the legislation. It's more like that person's not wearing a helmet, give them a fine, tell them not to ride their bike, move on, not use it as an excuse to search them for weapons or stolen property or drugs or whatever. I think that was what their take on it, and hence they get into this hidden justice thing. And the interesting thing was how some suburbs out west are absolutely getting smashed with fines for not wearing a helmet, whereas other areas, like Hunters Hill, etc., very low crime area, very wealthy area, very white area, absolutely zero fines. Now that could be because no one in Hunters Hill is riding around on a bicycle. Maybe they're all driving around in their Porsches and Maseratis and Rolls Royces, and no one stoops to riding a bicycle. Somehow I doubt that. There's probably a lot of merchant bankers over there riding around on $12,000 carbon bikes. Anyway, so we can see here, Blacktown, for instance, 1,445 fines versus Mossman getting 2. And Mossman is full of merchant bankers riding expensive bikes. It's, kind of mammal central on a weekend. You'll never see more Macquarie bankers, etc., riding around on bikes as you will in Mossman on a Sunday morning, and then pulling into a nice coffee shop for a cafe. So the western suburbs, they're absolutely copping it, and Penrith as well. Now, and of course, if we scroll down here to the end, why is it that they're cracking down on this? And it says here, let's see, where are we? Sorry, just bear with me here. Centre for Road Safety, that's a New South Wales government body. Cyclists must obey the rules. Yeah, okay, I do agree that if the legislation says you've got to wear a helmet, you've got to wear a helmet. You can campaign to have the legislation overturned, but don't complain that the law is stupid. Write to your MP and get the law changed. But this is the more interesting stuff. Cyclists who wear helmets reduce their risk of dying from a head injury by 65%, according to New South Wales research. Well, interestingly enough, cyclist deaths are up quite steeply this year, and I think about 2/3 of the cyclists who were killed were wearing a helmet, but they ran into immovable forces. Like there was a food courier driver killed just a week or two ago on Parramatta Road. He, by the sounds of things, he moved into the path of a tip truck with a dog on, I don't mean a puppy dog, I mean a dog trailer on the back, and was presumably crushed to death. A helmet's not going to help you in those circumstances. But they're going in here about, we know that riding dangerously, such as running red lights, not wearing a helmet, contributes to cyclist injuries and fatalities. I haven't actually seen any proof that that's the case, and that's why we increased the penalties for bicycle riders who commit high-risk offences. No, I think that's because Duncan Gay, who was the minister back then, absolutely hated cyclists with a passion, and Mr. Carlin is, in my opinion, talking out of his bum. Anyway, let's go on to the actual article itself from the Alternative Law Journal. So I think you could probably say that this is probably looking at this topic from a social justice perspective. And it goes, there's many pages of stuff in here. Now, what I was really interested in here is there are some tables, for instance, on fines, etc. But what I really wanted to look at was there any breakdown of age groups as to who exactly is copping these fines? We can see it by region or by local government area or by local police local area command. That Penrith and Blacktown are getting lots of fines and Mossman's getting almost none. But who is, is it 60-year-old cyclists, pottering down to the RSL for a beer, copping a fine, or is it 15-year-old kids riding around the back streets, etc. And it says here, for instance, that the age profile of hospitalised cyclists has changed over time, with the number of those over 25 years of age increasing and those under 25 declining. Injury severity has also increased with age. Those over 45 were more likely to have life-threatening injuries and longer stays in hospital. Now, that brings up an interesting point, because if we go into, for instance, some Boxar statistics about crime and justice and age-specific rates of offending over the last 25 years, it's very clear from this document that most crime is committed by young males. And look, that's absolutely nothing new to anyone, I think, who's probably ever bothered studying crime stuff, that kind of the teenagers through to, I guess, late 20s is the prime time for people stealing cars, breaking into robbery, assault, shoplifting, all that kind of stuff. And you can see here that 35 plus for breaking into, for instance, well, it's just this flat line down the bottom, whereas 15 to 17 there's stacks. Okay, it's declined quite significantly over the last 25 years, but it's still concentrated in this cohort from 10 to 14 up to, well, I guess about 30 years old, and then people, well, they become law abiding. Now, whether that's because they're sick of getting locked up, or they've just grown up and gotten over their kind of teenage hormonal things, or they've got a family and they've settled down, or I don't know, they've died. That it doesn't matter what thing you look at here. Motor vehicle theft, who's committing all the crime? 15 to 17, 18 to 20, 21 to 24. Robbery, again, there's those same groups. And what about the 35-year plus? Nothing. I guess, what would it look like if you had a 40 to 49 age group here? Well, that'd probably be, on this grey line at the bottom. Serious non-domestic assault, again, we don't see it with the youngsters, 10 to 14, but we certainly see it 18 to 20s, 15 to 17, 21 to 24, they're getting in the punch-ups. So, I think what we could say, from looking at this data is, young people are much more likely to break the law, thumb their nose at the law, and older people are much more likely to obey the law. And certainly, my observation from cycling around since the lockdown is the number of cyclists has doubled or tripled in some areas, well, in fact, probably most areas, and the number of people I've seen not wearing a helmet has gone up anywhere between 5 and 10 times. So there's been this massive spike, and I've got to say that most of the people I see not wearing a helmet are in, this kind of 15 to 30-year-old age group, I would say. I mean, there are some outliers, but, the majority is, certainly this younger group. Now, given that we've got 2 or 3 times more people cycling on the road and perhaps 5 to 10 more times riding without a helmet, what we'd expect to see in the injury statistics is over the last couple of months, emergency departments will be reporting a massive spike in people coming in with head injuries or cycling related injuries. And the problem we've got is if we go to the Centre for Road Safety Statistics, the statistics they've got only go up to 2018. Now, I hope at some point in the future they're going to refresh this and we can look back on this period and see, what's happened during the lockdown when there's lots of cyclists on the road, lots of people not wearing helmets, but also very little traffic. And the reason I bring that up is what's actually the biggest risk or the biggest cause of head injuries to cyclists? Is it not wearing a helmet, or is it high traffic volumes? And when you remove the high traffic volumes, do head injuries plummet, even though people are not wearing helmets? Now, this is quite a good little interactive system here. So, for instance, if we can go through here and we can look at road user groups, and can we do this? Sorry, hang on. Okay, we're going to filter by pedal cyclist, and we're then going to look at it by age group. And so you can see here that over the last 25 years, the standout group as far as injuries have gone is the 5 to 16 age group, followed by the 40 to 49, interestingly enough. And you can see here, these are the groups that we're talking about just a minute ago as being the least law-abiding. So the people least likely to wear a helmet, certainly in my opinion, are these age groups: 17 to 20, 21 to 25, 26 to 29. And then, as we saw, people grow up and they stop stealing cars. So this is where I wanted to look at the data on the tickets that are issued by police to people not wearing a helmet. Is there a massive spike in the 5 to 16s, or is it lots of 17 to 20s, or is it older people that are copping all the tickets? And somehow I doubt, frankly, that older people are copying the tickets. But prove me wrong, show me the data. Because let's say, for instance, they're issuing heaps, and maybe in Blacktown they might have issued 1,500 tickets to people in the 17 to 20 age group, in the belief that those people are at most risk of having a head injury from crashing their bike. But then we look at the statistics and go, well, actually they're one of the most least likely groups to be injured on a bicycle. And you might say, well, why is that? And well, there's a number of reasons. Lots of people, kids, they get given a bike, they ride it with their mates on the weekends, they go and do high risk activities like create their own BMX tracks or jumps in the street, and they jump over things and they crash, and or they're racing each other or whatever. And then they turn 17, they get a driver's license, they buy a car, and for the next 15 years or so, they're driving everywhere, and then in their early 30s they wake up and go, oh geez, I'm getting a bit fat, I need to do some exercise. And suddenly they've gone and bought a bicycle, they've bought some lycra, and they're riding around as a mammal on the weekend trying to burn the weight off. And hence we have these hordes of 30 to 60 year olds every weekend taking over the coffee shops in their lycra after they've been out for a 50k ride, which is something that just doesn't interest this group. They're more interested in driving down the pub and sleeping in on the weekend. But anyway, let's just keep that in mind, that we've got this really big spike of 5 to 16 year olds getting injured, and then the next biggest group is the 40 to 49s. So if we go into serious injury trends, and again what we can do is we can break this down by pedal cyclists. If you're a motorcyclist, you might want to do the same to have a look at this. And we can see that injuries have been steadily climbing over time. And if we look at the location of injuries, right, we're interested in head injuries. And again, we can see since 1995 up until 2018, the numbers grew and they kind of flatlined around this number here. Now, let's break that down by not by gender, let's break it down by age group. And we saw that 5 to 16 was a really big group in terms of injuries, far and away had the highest number of overall injuries. But remember, when we look down at these locations of injuries, head, neck, thorax, abdomen, shoulder, elbow, wrist, blah blah blah, for all we know, those people might have been presenting to hospital with nature of injuries. I mean, we'd have to actually go and have a look, but it might just be things like fractures and open wounds, the kind of stuff that certainly I got as a kid, falling off, tearing a bit of skin off on the road and stuff like that, or cutting yourself open and needing some stitches, or breaking an arm. I certainly know some kids that have broken their arms multiple times over the last few years. But you can see here, 5 to 16 age group, head injuries, it's actually come down. And the total number in the last reporting year was 70. In fact, the highest number in the last 10 years or so was 89. So let's just go on to the next group. Just remember those numbers, 89 and 70. So you get to the 17 to 20 group, and suddenly the number of head injuries is, well, 24 to 17 in the last reporting year. That's what, about a third of the 5 to 16s? Well, of course, this is, a 4-year group, and this is, 11 years. So, yeah, it's obviously a bigger population here, I guess, but, you've got to take that with a pinch of salt. 21 to 25, again, down pretty low, 22, 21. Not a lot of head injuries in that group. 26 to 29, again, 26 and 19. Look, it's grown, but, it's fairly low. Now, 30 to 39, again, this is where we started to see people jumping back on the bikes. And certainly we can see back in 2014, it was 80 head injuries. Thankfully dropped down to, 51. What about the 40 to 49 group? I mean, this is where we really started to see people banging themselves up. And look at this. From 1995 to 2018, huge increase from 23 to 76. That's it's more than tripling the number of injuries, and we haven't seen that in any of the other age groups, have we? This pretty much straight line increase over the period where it's grown by such an extent. And let's look at the older age groups as well. What's happening there? Even in the 50 to 59 group, went from 18, peaked at 64. So again, that's an increase of nearly going up by a factor of 4. I mean, it's dropped back down to 43, so that's only tripled rather than quadrupled, but still a pretty big increase. And look, even in the the over 60s, they're getting out on their bikes. It's gone from 12 to 45. Almost going up by a factor of 4. Really big increase. Are the old people getting out on their bikes? Flippin' heck, yes. Even the 70 to 79s. One up to a peak of 26. Let's take it from here, 6 up to 20. So, increasing by a factor of 3 or 4 if you want to go with this year. Again, really big increases in the number of injuries in these age groups. And look, what did we say earlier? These age groups are the groups that are most likely to be law-abiding and wearing a helmet. And in fact, if you want to join a weekend ride, a Saturday ride or a Sunday ride or an early morning ride, it goes out at 5 a.m. on a Tuesday, for instance, that's organised by a club or a user group or whoever, the rules of those rides, which are published on their websites, are unless you turn up with a helmet and you're wearing it properly, you are not allowed to ride. And that's because clubs, etc., normally have insurance, etc., and they don't want to invalidate that by having people riding without a helmet, since riding with a helmet is the law. And they'll just boot you off. You're not riding with us. And that's why if you ever look at a pack of mammals riding past on their way to a coffee shop on a Sunday, you'll see they're all wearing helmets. But the interesting flip side of that is that same group has seen a massive increase in head injuries. So what's going on here? The police are handing out lots of fines, they're expensive fines, yet head injuries continue to grow within these user groups. Now, is that because we're seeing the same thing here as we do with motorcycles, that older people get on motorbikes and they're crashing like crazy because they're not as fit, not as strong, and the reactions aren't as good as they were when they were 20, or they're trying to ride like they're 20 and they're not 20 anymore. That could be a factor. I mean, another thing could just be, the riding in groups. And when you're riding in a group, you really do have to watch what you're doing. Lack of communication or a bit of inattention, and suddenly you're touching wheels with someone, or you missed a bollard that was called out and you crash into it, or something or other. The potential for prangs is reasonably high. You're also moving faster than you would be if you were riding on your own. Or, the other answer is all these people are just out for a ride on their own or with a mate, and they're getting hit by drivers who aren't watching what they're doing. Drunk drivers, drug drivers, drivers TikToking on their mobiles, aggressive drivers who want to scare them and hit them because they can't judge distance properly. All that kind of stupid, or people just racing to get somewhere, and they go racing in front of you and then immediately turn left, or they go through a roundabout without giving way to you because you're on a bike and they're in a car and they're bigger and you'll just have to put up with it. Maybe the other factors. So, this comes back to the public policy aspect, that all the attention is paid by the police and the road safety experts, and I'll use that in inverted commas, to wearing a helmet, when maybe the emphasis should be on providing safe, separated infrastructure. And this comes back to now trying to get some statistics covering March, April, May, where we've been in lockdown. Vehicle traffic in some areas down by 80%, bicycle traffic up by 200 or 300%, helmet disobedience up by maybe 500% or more. Has that been accompanied, like this graph? Have we suddenly seen this go shooting off up here somewhere? That we didn't have 76 head injuries amongst this group. We've suddenly had like 200, because that's what you'd expect, wouldn't you, if not wearing a helmet was as risky as people say it is. So it's probably going to be quite some time before those numbers come out. In the meantime, we'll just have to sit back and watch. But look, I've certainly seen nothing in the media complaining about this massive spike in cyclists turning up at emergency with head injuries, occupying lots of emergency beds, which are required for patients that might have caught a horrible disease and need to come in and be stuck on a ventilator, and they're taking up an urgently needed bed. And all these dangerous cyclists should start wearing helmets for the sake of everybody else, or they should stop cycling. There's none of that. Absolutely none. Our emergency wards are not full of cyclists hooked up to ventilators, are they? So, that kind of paints a picture. Let's just see what happens when the data comes out, whether, that all holds true. Anyway, I think I've kept you for long enough. I'm going to cut it off here. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening.